In this video, we'll look at branching and hierarchies in the Unity editor, and how to parent objects and what happens when we parent. I'm working in a clean scene here, and I'm going to go into my Models folder and into the environment. I'll take my clock model, and I'm going to drag it from the project into the hierarchy, placing it at the position where it was exported from in whatever application it was authored with. Then, I'm going to take my train and I'm going to pull it again into the scene. In this case, I'm going to place it arbitrarily where I want it. Right now, these are two independent objects, and they both have their own transform. The train at a position of almost 5, negative 0.57, and a z of negative 2. The clock here is at 0, 0. If I move the clock, nothing happens to the train. If I rotate the clock, again, nothing happens. There's no parenting relationship. What I'll do is to parent the clock to the train by dragging it on top. When we drag under an object, it moves it around in the hierarchy. Dragging on top of an object highlights that object in a blue oval, and we see now that the clock has become a child of that train. The train now has an arrow next to it, which we can open up if we need, seeing the children of the train object. The clock can still move and rotate independently. However, when we pick the train and move it, what we can see here is that moving one moves both. Selecting the parent selects the children. I'll switch from the center over to the object pivot, and again, moving the train moves the clock. Rotating the train then rotates the train and the child clock based on the train's pivot. This is important because what happens here is that the child takes its pivot from the parent. So that if we rotate this train, let's say on the y-axis, that child clock, even though it has its own pivot, is rotated by its parent around the parent's pivot. To unparent then, simply pick a child and drag it out from its parent, and it becomes unique again on the hierarchy and can be independently rotated or moved. We can identify then children because they are inset here in the hierarchy. The clock then is indented down from the train. And again, selecting one selects both. So we can tell either by selecting or by looking in the hierarchy to see what is the parent relationship. One final note on parenting. The scale of both of these objects is set to 1. They've been imported and scaled properly. Scaling a parent may have odd effects on a child, especially if the parent is scaled and rotated. What we may see, depending on how and when these were scaled and parented, is that we get a shearing or skewing of the child. Be careful then of parenting and scaling. You may have seen this in other 3D applications. When children are rotated on parents that are scaled, we get an odd stretching. Bear this in mind then when you're parenting of what's going to go on with these objects, and are you going to be scaling at all over the course of the game. It's very possible in a scene in a game to have several hundred, if not several thousand objects, and maintaining a consistent and organized hierarchy is important, so you can find your way around to each one of them. We've seen how I can take one object and parent it under another, and commonly what we'll also do is to parent under empty game objects, providing one single point of selection in which we'll have multiple things parented, often with children of their own. I'm going to parent my train and clock here. I'll right-click in the hierarchy and choose Create Empty, creating an empty game object. Remember, an empty game object is simply a transform in space. There's no mesh attached to it, no actual object other than a point out there. What I'll do is to give this game object a recognizable icon, clicking on the cube to the left of the name, and I'll choose a yellow capsule. Now we can click on it and select it in the scene. Previously, we would have had to go to the hierarchy to select it. What I'm going to do then is to take that train hierarchy I've created with the clock and drag it under the empty game object. Now, simply selecting the game object selects both props, and clicking just on the game object's capsule selects both. What we'll do in the coming videos then, using this technique, is to construct our game level and our lighting, and parent under empty game objects. This way, rather than having another object in the scene, we've got a unique game object with just a capsule, and we can hide that if we need, to be able to parent and select and organize under. Again, to see what's in that hierarchy, click on the arrow to the left of the name and open it up. What we can see in here is that clock is a child of train, train is a child of game object. Selecting each parent selects its children. So if we select train, we can still rotate the train and the clock. Selecting the game object and rotating it rotates both. The other advantage this gives us is another pivot. As we can see very readily, this gives us the opportunity of essentially constructing a rig here, where we've got multiple linked objects with their own rotations, giving us the possibility of dependent rotations if we need for an animation, for example. At any point, you can simply turn off that capsule by clicking on the capsule and choosing None, or hide the entire hierarchy by unchecking Game Object, hiding all of its children and the actual game object itself.